From the Carpathian Mountains in the west, along the northern shore of the Black Sea, to the foothills of the Caucasus stretches one of the largest countries of Europe, the Ukraine. For centuries, this fertile land, often referred to as the breadbasket of Europe, has been the object of conquest and a thoroughfare for commerce between the Baltic and Black Sea regions, a bridge between Western Europe and Asia. In 988, at the behest of the great prince of the Kievan Rus, Saint Vladimir, Christianity in its Byzantine form took root in the Ukraine. In those days, the Christian Church still considered itself as one and undivided, despite its evolution into various Eastern and Western traditions. This awareness allowed the early Church of Kiev to maintain friendly relations with Rome and kept it out of active participation in the subsequent rift between Rome and Byzantium. In the 13th century, Kiev was sacked by the Mongols. Neighboring nations divided the Kievan state among themselves. During the period of Kiev's decline as a political center, it fell to Western Ukraine to uphold its historical continuity. Meanwhile, the ascendant state of Moscow had adopted expansive political goals, which included using the Church as a means of becoming the exclusive heirs of the ancient Kievan state and, subsequently, even challenging Byzantium for the leadership of the Orthodox world. This threat, combined with the growing influence of the Protestant Reformation and the widespread moral decline in their own church, the Kievan bishops turned to Old Rome for assistance at their Synod of Brest-Litovsk in 1596.
Their intention was to protect and retain the Eastern identity of their church, yet they also hoped that renewing communion with the Apostolic See of Rome would help counter the threat of the Protestant Reformation, assist in the reform of their church, and bring it social equality with the Latin Church.
The renewed communion of the Kievan Church with Rome was vehemently opposed by the Orthodox Patriarchates of Constantinople and Moscow. So the history of what is now popularly known as the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church became a struggle for the right to exist as an Eastern Church in communion with Rome.
Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй.
From the early 17th century to the outbreak of World War II, the Ukraine was invariably divided into two parts, a western part under the Polish state and an eastern part under the Russian Empire. The Russian Tsars had declared themselves defenders of orthodoxy and promoters of pan-Slavic unity, effectively a Russian melting pot for all non-Russian Slavs and Orthodox believers. Their main anger was directed against the Ukrainian Church in communion with Rome because it symbolized political and ecclesiastical independence from Moscow. Each time they gained control over a part of the Ukraine, they outlawed and persecuted this Ukrainian Church. In the 18th century, 8 of 12 million Ukrainian faithful loyal to Rome were forced to embrace Russian Orthodoxy. Eastern Catholics practically ceased to exist on Ukrainian lands in the Russian Empire.
For over 300 years, this country was part of the Russian Empire. Later, with the Bolshevik uprising of 1917, it was not spared the bloody events that followed the creation of a totalitarian regime, one of whose principal policies was mass forced atheism.
Складовою частиною політики якого була масова атеїзація.
Armed Ukrainian resistance to the Bolsheviks lasted until late 1921. Militarily outgunned, its fate was sealed. Unleashing a reign of terror, Moscow first installed a so-called Soviet Ukrainian puppet government and then set about the mass liquidation of Ukrainian intellectuals and the complete suppression of all national, religious and cultural freedoms. The wave of terror climaxed in 1933-34 when the communists decided to collectivize agriculture by force and rob the peasants of their means of livelihood. More than 6 million people suffered death by starvation in this Ukrainian Holocaust.
The Bolsheviks failed to create an aesthetic awareness, but they did succeed in destroying all moral principles and the people's feeling of self-esteem.
As soon as the Red Army acquired total control of Western Ukraine in 1944, the Soviet government immediately resorted to old Tsarist policies and began persecuting the Greek Catholic Church, the name given to the Eastern Church in communion with Rome. All Ukrainian Greek Catholic bishops were summarily arrested, tried under false charges, and deported to Siberia.
After the war, Stalin implemented a policy aimed at destroying the traditional identity of Western Ukrainian life. Anti-church policies played an important part in this program of Sovietization. It was not simply a policy of introducing atheism, but rather a concerted attempt to marginalize the Catholic Church by deporting the Polish population to Poland on the one hand, and on the other by forcibly incorporating the Greek Catholics into the Russian Orthodox Church, even though historically the two had never been united before. In 1946, a pseudo-synod took place. Not one single Greek Catholic bishop attended, because in fact it had been organized by the KGB as a forum to announce the supposed self-dissolution of the Greek Catholic Church and the automatic conversion of all Greek Catholics to the Orthodox faith.
Father Kostelnik opens the session of the Synod.
I declare our Holy Synod open, convoked to unite the Greek Catholic Church with the Russian Orthodox Church. I propose that the Synod should rule on the following matters. 1. to annul the provisions of the Union of Brest-Litovsk from the year 1596. 2. To separate from the Papal Church of Rome. 3. To unite with the All-Russian Orthodox Church on the territory of the Soviet Union. All those in favor of these proposals, lift your hand.
All participants of the Lviv Synod of the Greek Catholic Church unanimously accept Father Kostelnik's proposals.
The scenario drawn up by the authorities was supposed to portray the dissolution of the Church as an act of self-liquidation, as an act of voluntary unification with the Russian Orthodox Church. A special plan was prepared to achieve this. We now have access to documents showing how this was done. The Soviet authorities were able to find, let us call them turncoats, willing to collaborate with them.
A newly consecrated bishop is vested.
One result of the Greek Catholic Church formally being declared non-existent was the automatic transfer of all Greek Catholic property to the Russian Orthodox Church. Several years later, when the Greek Catholic Church ceased to exist, the authorities applied the full measure of Soviet repression, as previously applied in the eastern Ukraine, whereby churches were burned, demolished, converted into warehouses, and subjected to all manner of sacrilege. When a church was closed, the faithful made every effort to hide the more precious items like chalices, liturgical items, as well as valuable icons, wherever they could, including in their own homes.
Everything in the church was battered and broken. This icon of Mother of God was brought to me at night. God, what I did to hide it. For a while it was in the attic, then behind the wardrobe. The Mother of God stood over there. When someone came, they would not suspect anything, as it was well hidden behind the wardrobe. And even when they organized raids in the village, I would lock the house and run so that nobody would enter. I sewed a sack and hid the icon as best as I could. Nobody knew that I had an icon. Had they found out, they would have turned my house upside down and destroyed everything. The people who knew me did not betray me. It wasn't easy. My children were small. But the good Lord helped me and I was not taken away.
And so it was, especially under Khrushchev, and this is a paradox since the West associates Khrushchev with liberal policies and the introduction of a measure of freedom, that the most severe church closing policies were introduced. That even included the closing of churches that formerly belonged to the Russian Orthodox Church.
In 1960, Nikita Khrushchev boasted at the 21st Congress of the Communist Party that within 20 years he would appear on television to reveal, as a curiosity, the last surviving Christian in the USSR. Khrushchev assured his audience that after the death of this individual, Christianity would cease to exist altogether in what he dubbed the fatherland of the holy proletariat.
Clearly, the Greek Catholic Church did not immediately disappear after its official abolition. Firstly, because its believers continued to practice their faith, maintaining a tradition of old religious practices and customs. Secondly, and more importantly, because despite the extreme use of force, repression, deportation and other means of coercion, part of the clergy, mainly monks, did not yield to this policy of enforced orthodoxy and instead went underground into the catacombs. This resulted in the creation of one of the largest underground churches of the 20th century and at the same time one of the most powerful opposition forces within the Soviet Union.
This village has a rich tradition of freedom, fighting and desire for national independence. It is also deeply religious. Greek Catholics lived here right up to the war. There were no other denominations. In 1946, when the Greek Catholic Church was declared illegal, part of the community adopted the Orthodox faith at that time, while the rest remained true to the faith of their fathers and stopped going to the Orthodox Church. Underground Catholic priests first started arriving here after Stalin's death, sometime after 1953. In the days of the underground, this path was the one most often used by clandestine priests. You have here a well-trodden path that led to the faithful houses, where they could hear the true word of God, the word of the gospel. The Eucharist was often celebrated in this building, despite the mortal dangers. The underground faithful never denounced one another. Of course, masses were celebrated in great secrecy, behind closed doors. People prayed in silence. Singing was impossible. We would meet in different houses to pray. Priests also came, and we prayed together. But we were always afraid. We were always afraid. I remember it was the summer. The Greek Catholic Church was still in the underground. The bishop was due to come to celebrate the Eucharist in our house. There were many people present, confessions taking place in one room, preparations for the liturgy in the other. We would decorate the room to resemble a real church, as much as possible. People entered our room through the back door in twos and threes, always in silence. Our grandfather was a very devout Greek Catholic. His faith was so strong that it would prove difficult to find another such a person in our village. The local party instructed him to join the party, saying that he would want for nothing. He always answered, "This is not for me. If I join the party, I will stop serving God and start serving the devil instead." He refused to join, and right from the start, underground priests visiting our village received all the support he could give them. He was the only one in the village to own a car. It was not easy for Greek Catholic priests to reach us, because some people would recognize them when they used public transport and report them to the authorities. So they came by night. But then there were no buses, so whenever necessary, my grandfather would drive them to the next village or town, so that they could celebrate the liturgy. We gathered, but he did not come. The wenting went on and on. We grew nervous and worried that perhaps the militia. But the people kept praying, preparing for the liturgy. Finally, he arrived in the car, but he had been followed. The militia and the head of the village council had noticed the car entering the village. They knew the street where the liturgy would most likely be celebrated. That car was also a sign for the faithful that the liturgy was most likely to be celebrated. And so they searched down the entire street, looking into every house, but no one could see where the car had disappeared. In fact, it stood locked in the garage. In the meantime, we had parked another car in front of the garage so that everything looked normal. The head of the village council, accompanied by the militia, entered the yard. But it never struck them that the car might be in the garage. They searched everywhere without finding out that the liturgy was being celebrated in our house, in the very heart of the village. Besides the underground liturgy, the priest's visit was a welcome opportunity for confession, for a marriage ceremony, and to have children baptized. Members of the Greek Catholic community who did not attend Orthodox Church services were persecuted by the KGB and mocked by fellow villagers. It was particularly difficult for children when they were laughed at. They would call us sectarian. They would say, "You are not even Christians. You belong to a sect." Morally, that was very difficult for us to live with. Our parents would teach us that we belonged to the Universal Catholic Church, while our friends and other villagers would say something completely different. Naturally, our upbringing and faith in God helped us to live through the jeering and persecutions suffered by our parents. At that time, we did not understand the meaning of true Christianity and the faith of our parents.
Key to the survival of the Greek Catholic faith was the role played by the older generation. Grandmothers and grandfathers not only kept religious traditions alive for the next generation, but also protected and hid priests from the security forces, particularly those who refused to bow to the pressure of becoming Orthodox. These priests not only chose a fugitive existence, but also risked their lives to fulfill their priestly ministry in the underground church.
Priests led a dual existence, doubling during the day as accountants and doctors. It was extremely uplifting to know that there were people who refused to be broken, that there existed a structure, the clandestine church, that refused to surrender to the regime. This was a crucial factor when the moment came to leave the underground. Nobody suspected that I lived here. This was a small cottage with two old people who were her parents. She was still a small girl at the time.
And I lived with my parents in one bedroom.
Yes, that's right. The window curtains were drawn so there was little light and nobody from outside could see inside that I lived here. Nobody knew I lived here. So when I settled, I never showed my face to anyone or went outside throughout my stay here. I never went out, unless somebody was ill. Then I would only visit them at night and then go home.
A place for you to stay had to be found. People did not want to hear about it. They were afraid. They had rooms, but they were afraid. My parents said, "We place our trust in God. May His will be done." And they took him in.
In the late 1980s, the increased political and social awareness in the individual Soviet republics, together with Gorbachev's policy of glasnost and perestroika, and his imminent visit to the Vatican, kindled sentiment in Western Ukraine that the time was ripe to demonstrate openly for the religious rights of Ukrainian Greek Catholics.
Our bishops went to Moscow and started a hunger strike for the legalization of the Greek Catholic Church. Many journalists covered the event and everyone spoke freely. And so we announced to the world that such a church existed, that a people were struggling for the rights of the Greek Catholic Church. For many did not know that we even existed. Our banners proclaimed that we numbered 5 million Catholics and that we wanted to pray in our own places of worship. We demanded that our sanctuaries be returned. 72 of us slept in rows in one room for 6 months. And that was how we slept. That was the duration of our hunger strike. Some people participated for a week, others even for up to a month. I myself took part 4 times for a week at a time. Newspapers began writing about us. Photographs were taken, and the daily newspapers, Svoboda, reported continually about our hunger strike. As a result, we achieved our goal, and the Greek Catholic Church was legalized.
The Greek Catholic Church was legally registered as an official religion of the Ukraine in 1990. Thousands of faithful subsequently left the Orthodox Church to return to the Greek Catholic communities of their forefathers. Although legalized, the Greek Catholic Church was not rehabilitated, which meant that all church properties confiscated and given to the Orthodox Church after 1946 were not historically recognized as belonging to the Greek Catholic Church and thus not returned. Unfortunately, this contributed to disputes and divisions between the Greek Catholic and Orthodox communities, which remain to this day.
In 1989, at least 1,000 parish communities declared, very clearly, that they wanted to return to the faith of their fathers. Even though they had accepted sacraments in Orthodox churches, the Orthodox Church was unable to keep them from leaving.
To avoid aggravating the situation regarding the Orthodox Church, many Greek Catholics took the initiative into their own hands and began building new churches, a remarkable feat in light of the extensive destruction suffered by existing Greek Catholic churches.
After the war, plans were afoot to take this Greek Catholic Church apart to meet the needs of the kolkhoz, but the people united and stopped it. But then the militia came with tractors and people were chased away. Some were carried off, others fined, albeit with small fines. Then they did a pretty good job of what they'd intended to do. The church looked as if Tartars had attacked it. They even moved the foundations. There was now no question of repairing it. So, in the early 1990s, the villagers built a new Orthodox church. The building of a Greek Catholic church was out of the question. But as more and more priests left the underground, the more historically aware people started leaving the Russian Orthodox Church to join us, and started to collect money to help build a church. I was baptized in the Catholic Church. I was born when the Greek Catholic Church still legally existed, so why should I be a member of the Orthodox Church? My son is a Greek Catholic priest. We began with a tiny chapel, and to this day celebrate the Eucharist there. We have no money to continue the construction of a new one.
The return to the Greek Catholic Church and the widespread yearning for religious rebirth after decades of communist oppression sparked the need for new churches, particularly in developing residential areas where no church had been foreseen by Soviet city planners.
Parishioners used to travel to the cathedral in the city centre, but there was never enough space there, so we built a provisional chapel here. In 1994, we began to build our own church, which is now nearing completion thanks to God and the assistance of Aid to the Church in Need. All that remains to be done before we can attend our new church is the plastering and heating. There are many people who often do not have anything to eat. Yet, when it comes to building a church, a Greek Catholic Church, somehow, in a mysterious way, they offer their time, their energy, and even the little money they have.
Poverty is extreme in the Ukraine. The average monthly salary is about $20, and standards of living are very low. Despite this, new churches and convents are springing up like mushrooms after rain. The spiritual renewal is so strong that not only are the churches full, but also the monasteries and convents cannot find enough space for new candidates.
I was baptized illegally in my aunt's house. I was 6 years old when the priest came. All I can remember is that we always celebrated the main religious feasts such as Easter and Christmas. Our family celebrated on those days, unlike others who were very skeptical. We usually visited our grandmother in the village, where nobody would recognize us. I remember how we used to eat pashal bread at Easter, and how we would sit at a festive table to celebrate Christmas Eve. My father was a believer, but he could not risk celebrating these holy days at home where someone could find out. We had been looking for a long time for a place like this to house our convent. Enough space for the first 10 sisters, and God's providence brought about that we received an offer from the head of the village council, who suggested that we settle here.
We had buildings that were not in use, and I think it was God's will that we should welcome the sisters here. At first we'd become acquainted with Father Grigory, and only later did we get around to talking about how good it would be if nuns could establish a monastery in our village.
О боголюбивім єпископі архімандриті нашим кир Любомирі, о боголюбивім єпископі нашим кир Михаїлі, чеснім пресвітерстві є живо Христі діяконстві, о всем пришті люди, Господу помолімося.
When we arrived, the place looked like a ruin. Nobody had lived here for a year and there was no heating. But we were very happy, for we had a place where we would begin our work. Aid to the Church in Need organisation more than anybody helped us get started. Their financial support allowed us to carry out major repairs on one of the larger buildings, where we now have our cells, a refectory, a kitchen and a small office. We were also able to build a wall around our convent. That was very important for us, as the convent is located in the centre of the village. Otherwise, the sisters would suffer discomfort, particularly when they want to pray, or to be outdoors in the garden alone.
Стріли твоя і сошрене сильне людія под тобою падуть з серця враг. Наш спосіб життя вимагає.
For a contemplative nun, having her own cell meets a vital need in her monastic life. That need cannot for the moment be met for all the sisters. Not even a quarter of our sisters have their own cell. Many have to share a cell with 3, 4 or 5 other sisters.
По троє, по четверо.
Every soul needs at least an hour of solitude with God. In the evening, when you are tired after a day's work, one's desire is to be alone with God. And so one searches for a free corner. Each one of us needs that, a separate room in which you can pray in solitude. We rise at 3:30, Matins are at 4, and the Eucharist is at 6. We have our first meal about 9, after which the sisters go about their work, sewing, weaving nets, or working in the garden.
There are many candidates wanting to enter, but alas, there is no more room. Recently, the abbot, the spiritual leader, told me that just as many female candidates would like to join. For me, it's a completely incomprehensible phenomenon which cannot be explained in human terms.
At first there were 10 sisters, now there are 26. More than anything, we would dearly like to redo and widen the chapel. It is already too small and we just do not fit. We have no library, no room large enough to gather village children for catechism classes.
It is our great hope that with a convent here in our midst, our children will be saved, that they will know which is the right path to take by imitating the good example offered them.
People would come to us on major feasts to attend the all-night vigils that last from Saturday through to Sunday. They would tell us that when they are here, they feel something extraordinary. In other words, the sisters' prayer uplifts them spiritually and helps them to live with God.
The call to serve God and give one's life entirely to Him is also present among young Ukrainian men.
I remember moments when our family had a deep experience of conversion and reconciliation with God. Of course, as children we all went to the Orthodox Church because it was always open, whereas the Greek Catholic Church was closed. Yet the Lord brought us into contact with Greek Catholics, and then one of the underground priests, a monk, often came to our home to celebrate the liturgy. From time to time we would gather together in an ordinary apartment so that nobody would notice. One could say that these experiences contributed to my vocation. This building formerly housed the village school in Kołodziejówka. The parish priest and community very much wanted monks to settle here. They made every effort to renovate the school and to a degree adapted it to meet the needs of monastic life. We wanted to rebuild anew the spiritual life of the village, because when we arrived we could feel that the village had been spiritually neglected. Many of the inhabitants did not lead Christian lives, so at first it was difficult for us to live and work with them. They were cold and listless, but thank God much has changed since then. In 1995, there were about 10 of us. Thanks be to God, our community now numbers 45, and we have many candidates waiting. Over the past 3 months, we have been able to take in 5 new candidates. Our community has 45 members, whereas the building is designed to accommodate only 20, for there are only 20 separate cells. But quite obviously, each one of us should have his own cell. The old school was in a very poor state and had been inadequately renovated.
I think also you only have to think perhaps back to the church of the past when the priests were separated from the people, too much so. I think the Greek Catholic Church is very much aware that the priests have to be part of the people and to live with the people and to be with them, educating them.
Lately, we have come to understand that we cannot live totally enclosed lives. If for no other reason than that 40 years of communism have spiritually scarred so many people. These people need spiritual support. They are wounded spiritually, mentally, and physically. 4 years ago, we started inviting local people to spend 1 day a month in prayer with us. On that day, the monastery is wholly preoccupied with organizing the day's liturgies. Priests hear confession from 7 in the morning to 9 at night. For us, it is also a sign of God's blessing, for we see how our Lord changes people.
The renewal of church and faith is evident not only among those called to a religious vocation. There is a growing awareness among the laity that they too have a role to play in renewing Christian values in the Ukraine.
The main aim of our publishing house is to help Ukrainians live better lives, to help them better understand the reason for their own existence. There is an acute need for books about the family, how to raise healthy children, and how to deal with family problems. Prayer books with liturgical texts are the best sellers, along with books dealing with the problem of sects, a growing problem in the Ukraine. When people aren't paid and the choice boils down to bread or books, bread always wins. But in spite of everything, I often see people spending money put aside for a rainy day to purchase a book or two. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
One of the most visible signs of a reawakening of faith in the Ukraine is Zarvanitsa, with its immense pilgrimages where up to 300,000 pilgrims gather for an annual act of repentance and reconciliation.
I suffer pain in my legs. I'm unable to walk very far. So thanks be to God I have been to Zarvanitsa once before.
This holy site dates back to the 13th century, when the Mother of God appeared here to an itinerant monk, inspiring him to paint a miraculous icon in her name. Miracles allegedly continue, and many people claim to have regained their health thanks to the purported miraculous healing powers attributed to the water that flows from its springs.
It was a tradition in my family to walk to Zarvanitsa 3 times a year. Our mother would wake us before sunrise. We were small and reluctant to get up, but we did, and then walked the 17 kilometers to Zarvanitsa.
Despite the economic difficulties and low standard of living, the Greek Catholic faithful have generously contributed their time and often the last of their meager financial resources to rebuild this Marian sanctuary, which the communists had destroyed. Where insufficient, help has come from Catholics in the West.
My dream was always for Zarvanitsa to grow. We built 2 retreat houses, pilgrim hostels, and a refectory. We had no money, so we began collecting penny by penny. Later, we received help from Aid to the Church in Need. I feel a great joy that it was possible to build such a sanctuary. It's unimaginable that such a large church could be finished in such a short time. Many thanks to those who gave money for this sanctuary. May the Lord bless them. Something enormous has been achieved, and its benefits will be with us to the end of the world.
Zarvanitsa is not only a place of pilgrimage, but also a holy site for both Greek Catholics and Orthodox faithful. It is a sanctuary where many pray for unity, following years of division and discord.
It is our desire that there be one fold and one shepherd. We dearly want our churches to be united.
I thought that if I went to Zarvanitsa, perhaps, God willing, we would become united. How terribly painful. One family in the same village, yet one member goes to one church, the other to another. So closely related, yet my wife's aunt goes here while my wife goes over there. How can that be? If you united us on the religious front, you will unite the Ukraine. From the ecumenical point of view, the situation is at a standstill. That fact is terrifying, because between the Orthodox and Greek Catholic churches, there are, frankly, no liturgical or theological differences. There is nothing that makes division inevitable. There is nothing that precludes unity. There is nothing like that. What we need is the will, yet there is no will in sight.
We are blood brothers. We are against barriers. So why should we remain divided? Surely our prayers today and tomorrow will unite us, making the Ukraine as one, prosperous, rich, such that we will attain untold prosperity that we fully deserve.
Today, the Greek Catholic Church stands at the crossroads of her passion and resurrection. The Passion, 70 years of communist persecution, has left a national heritage barren of spiritual and moral values. The resurrection, however, the signs of a reawakening faith, is evident in the growth of religious communities, the increase in priestly vocations, and the dedication to the construction of churches and sanctuaries. Resurrection, however, is only possible through the Passion, and if the Greek Catholic Church stands at all today, it is thanks to the shoulders of those who stood before, those who suffered persecution and carried the cross so that today the Church might live.
Вірні слуги Твого Сина, о Його любві, а за те славити буду, Маріє, Тебе